Assalamu alaikum guys. Okay, so in this video we are gonna talk about some very interesting factors that control the RBC maturation. The previous lecture we did all the steps which were involved in the maturation of red blood cells. I've given the link to that video. So if you haven't watched that, go on to that link and check out that video first before continuing on to this video. Okay, now let's begin. Do watch this video till the end so that you get all the concepts. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so basically the factors, there are two main factors which are responsible, which are responsible for the RBC maturation, that control RBC maturation. Okay, the two factors which are essential are the ones which control the DNA synthesis of the red blood cells. And these factors are namely the vitamin B12 and folic acid. Both of them are vitamins. Vitamin B12 is a water soluble vitamin. And so if you take excess of it, it will just get urinated out from the body. It is water soluble, and folic acid gets destroyed by heat. It is mainly present in green vegetables and meat, especially liver, but on cooking and heating it gets destroyed. Okay, so I'll start out from here. They're essential for DNA synthesis. Both the vitamin B12 and folic acid are essential for DNA synthesis, and both are needed for the synthesis of a special compound, a constituent of DNA called thymidine triphosphate. Well, this isn't new, guys. Thymidine is basically comes out from thymine. Thymine is a base of DNA, and thymine, when contains three phosphate groups, just like ATP, it contains three phosphate groups, so it is highly energetic and high. It is also called an activated nucleotide. It is a nucleotide of DNA, and it's since it contains three phosphate groups, it's a highly energetic molecule and called activated nucleotide. This activated nucleotide synthesis is controlled by vitamin B12 and folic acid concentration in the body. So they are extremely important for the synthesis of thymidine triphosphate. And so if thymidine triphosphate is properly made, then it is used in the building block of DNA. It is used as a building block of DNA, and so DNA synthesis occurs due to this thymidine triphosphate. Then this thymidine triphosphate is I have written it down that it is a thymine containing activated nucleotide that provides the DNA with the base thymine. Okay, so this thymine is needed. If vitamin B12 and folic acid are deficient, the lack of these vitamins may produce abnormal DNA in the new red blood cells which are being made, so the DNA might get abnormal in them, and so the failure of these cell division and maturation might occur. Maturation failure, a specific term called maturation failure is used for the condition that arises due to the lack of vitamin B12 and folic acid, both of them when they are decreased in concentration. So the maturation failure occurs due to abnormal DNA production due to lack of thymidine triphosphate, which is an activated nucleotide needed for the synthesis of DNA. Then moving forward, okay, now over here, red blood cells formed will have, okay, now those red blood cells which are formed in presence of low concentrations of B12 and folic acid, they'll have a larger than normal size because they won't be able to divide. So the large cells will remain large and they'll have irregular shape, and so they are these types of cells are called macrocytes. They are also called megaloblasts, or in the earlier stages, and megalocytes in the later stages. And when megaloblasts appear in the blood, they may cause megaloblastic anemia. Well, this is a condition in which megaloblasts are present in the blood, and they are megaloblasts. Why is it called anemia? Because these megaloblasts are pretty, although they can transport oxygen normally, but they are more fragile than the normal red blood cells, and so they have a shorter lifespan and hence are easily easily ruptured when they pass through tight junctions in the body. So megaloblasts are have a much shorter lifespan than the normal red blood cells. It's approximately 1/2 to 1/3 the normal lifespan of a normal red blood cell. Okay, so now let's move forward. The two types of maturation failures are the ones which arise due to vitamin B12 deficiency. Okay, I've given a common name of vitamin B12. It's also known as cyanocobalamin. Okay, and folic acid is also known as steroid glutamic acid. Okay, so the two types of maturation failures. First step might arise due to a lack of vitamin B12 in the diet, or vitamin B12 might be present in the diet, but it is not absorbed efficiently in the intestine. So This is the first maturation failure, and the second maturation failure is also related to the gastric mucosa, in which due to which both of them cannot be absorbed, and so again leading to maturation failures. Now we are going to talk about them one by one in detail. Okay, B12 deficiency. B12 deficiency arises due to mainly due to poor absorption of vitamin B12 from the gastrointestinal tract. Well, the absorption occurs in the ileum portion of the small intestine. So when the anemia that arises due to vitamin B12 deficiency, it's called pernicious anemia. Okay, this type of anemia in which vitamin B12 is not efficiently absorbed in the intestines, such anemia is called pernicious anemia, and we'll talk about them. Basic abnormality is an atrophic gastric mucosa. Atrophic means the cells of the gastric mucosa. The gastric means the mucosa of the stomach, the gastric, where the gastric juices, etc., are present. That mucosa, the cells of that mucosa, they start dying out. They are destroyed, and as a result, what happens? Uh, what happens is that the vitamin B12, since this gastric mucosa has a role in the absorption of vitamin B12, the vitamin B12 absorption in the ileum is not uh, proper due to the abnormality in the gastric mucosa. Now let's link the two roles, the role of gastric mucosa and the role of ileum in the absorption of vitamin B12. Now, the parietal cells of the gastric mucosa secrete HCl. We know that these parietal cells are also known as oxantic cells. They are responsible for HCl production. They are the acid producing cells of the stomach. In addition to HCl, they also produce a special glycoprotein called the intrinsic factor. This intrinsic factor, it has a special role, and it is responsible for the absorption of vitamin B12 in the ileum. So now let's see how it does that. It combines with the vitamin B12 in the food and makes the B12 available by absorption by the ileum in the following ways. Okay, firstly, the intrinsic factor, since I told you that it's a glycoprotein, it binds and secreted by the parietal cells. It binds to the B12 in the food, okay, and this binding is quite tight. And after this intrinsic factor B12 complex then moves in the bound state to the moves to the brush border. Brush border is basically the site of the small intestine which is formed due to the microvilli. There are specific receptors on the microvilli where the intrinsic factor can bind. The intrinsic factor containing the vitamin B12. It is bound to the vitamin B12, and in that bound state, it binds to the specific receptors on the brush border membranes of the mucosal cells in the ileum. Okay, what this binding does that after they bind to the receptors, endocytosis of this complex occurs. Specifically, is a pinocytosis of this complex that occurs, and this pinocytosis takes this complex into the intestinal cells, into the microvilli, and then after microvilli, this complex moves into the B12 intrinsic factor complex. It enters the blood capillaries within the villi. Basically, beneath the microvilli and within the villi, there are blood capillaries, and into the blood capillaries, into the bloodstream of the blood capillaries, this complex moves after passing into the cells of the mucosa, of the intestinal mucosa. And then what happens is that this B12 bound to the intrinsic factor, once it enters the blood, it is transported to via the hepatic portal vein. Hepatic portal vein is the vein that connects the intestines to the liver and transports the food substances which are absorbed from the intestine to the liver. Via the hepatic portal vein, this B12 along with the intrinsic factor is transported to the liver mainly for storage, and then is slowly released from the liver according to the requirement of the bone marrow. Well, in the bone marrow, as we know, that red blood cell production occurs, and B12 is an essential component for the maturation of red blood cells. Therefore, it is transported to the bone marrow, but according to the need of bone marrow. Okay, slowly and gradually it is transported to the bone marrow according to its requirement and demand. Now, how does this atrophic gastric mucosa come? How does the gastric mucosa become atrophic? There are specific reasons behind that. Well, one reason is that the immune system, or in some autoimmune diseases, the immune system of the body, the immune cells of the body, they start attacking the gastric mucosa cells. They start attacking the parietal cells in the gastric mucosa, and as a result, what happens that they are unable to produce intrinsic factor. And if intrinsic factor is not available, and so if the intrinsic factor is not available due to atrophic gastric mucosa, then B12 will not be absorbed into the ileum, into the microvilli. Okay, now I have okay, the minimum daily requirements for vitamin B12 is 1 to 3 micrograms. Okay, this is just an average value, and the amount which is stored in the liver is approximately 1000 times this amount. Okay, we've got a very large store of vitamin B12 in our liver. So therefore, if this intestinal mucosa does become atrophic, if the intrinsic factor is lacking, it will take up to 3 to 4 years for these stores of the liver of the vitamin B12 to become completely depleted. And so it will take about 3 to 4 years for the defective B12 absorption are required to cause a maturation failure anemia. Okay, this type of anemia is called maturation failure anemia because the red blood cells are unable to mature, and so if the red blood cells are unable to mature, they are unable to provide the blood with enough hemoglobin for oxygen transport, hence resulting in anemia. Okay, and in this case that we've just discussed, this type of maturation failure anemia is called pernicious anemia, in which the vitamin B12 is not absorbed in the ileum due to lack of intrinsic factor from the stomach, from the parietal cells of the stomach. Okay, so this was the first maturation failure that we just discussed, relating to the vitamin B12 deficiency due to atrophic gastric mucosa and inability of the body to absorb the B12 from the lumen of the intestines. Now, the second type of deficiency disease, or the second type of maturation failure disease, maturation failure that may arise, may be due to a combination of folic acid and vitamin B12 both. Okay, folic acid deficiency. Folic acid basically is a constituent of green vegetables and meat. Okay, green vegetables and especially the liver of the food that we eat, both of them, the constituents of both of them is folic acid, is loaded in the liver, and but heating will destroy the folic acid. So people with intestinal absorption abnormalities, example the disease sprue. Okay, let me talk about this disease. Okay, sprue is basically a condition in which the intestines, the small intestine, they become, the villi of the small intestine become flattened. So flattened would mean that their surface area have decreased and they become inflamed. The small intestine becomes inflamed, due to which the small intestine is unable to absorb both the vitamin B12 as well as the folic acid, and hence again RBC maturation failure might occur. Red blood cell maturation disease might occur, resulting in anemia again. Okay, so these were the two types of maturation failures that we need to discuss. In the next lecture, we are going to talk about the hemoglobin and iron metabolism. Well, to be more specific, in the next lecture, I'm going to make a detailed lecture on hemoglobin, the quaternary protein which is found inside the red blood cells, that is the main oxygen transporter, without which anemia can occur. Okay, guys. So thank you so much. I'll make sure to enter to put the link in the description down there. So please do check that video out as well. Thank you so much.